Good afternoon and welcome to Hudson Institute. My name is Daniel Batlle, and it is a pleasure today to have such an outstanding group of speakers to discuss this important topic. Ambassador Michael Fitzpatrick retired in 2024 from a distinguished career in the Foreign Service. He spent almost 39 years with the State Department in posts around Latin America, but also in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Pentagon. Most recently, he served as ambassador in Ecuador from 2019 to 2024. Dr. John Polga-Hecimovich is assistant professor at the U.S. Naval Academy. He teaches in the political science department, and his research focuses on the impact of institutions on democratic stability and governance. And Isabel Chiriboga comes to us from the Atlantic Council, where she is assistant director of the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center, and she leads the organization's work on organized crime and illicit trade. I want to start with you, Isabel, and to give us a high-level view before we dig into specifics. How would you characterize the situation in Ecuador, and what are some of the dynamics at play?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Dan, for inviting me, and thank you to the Hudson Institute for having me today. Difficult question, right? A lot going on these days in Ecuador, and great to have such a distinguished panel here with us. But I would say I would like to divide the answer of the high-level overview of the country in three parts. And the first, starting, with the current state of affairs. And we have Ecuador, right? It's as most of you know today, it's a country that is located in South America, off of the Pacific coast of the continent, between Colombia and Peru. And it has been characterized as a country that has been relatively stable, an island of peace, many had called it, over the last couple of decades. But during the last couple of years, we have seen that organized crime has really impacted Ecuador very largely. The population and the economy has been very, very much impacted by the infiltration of organized criminal groups. And it's been complicated for current governments and previous governments to really be able to hone in on the strategies and skills to really take over and dominate kind of the battle against criminal organizations in the country. But right now, we are currently in an internal armed conflict that was declared in January of 2024. And essentially what this means is that it allows for the deployment of military forces to be put out in the streets to fight some of the criminal gangs that have been denominated as terrorist organizations. In total, we have 22 criminal gangs under that designation currently. And it allows for a series of state of emergencies as well that impose curfews on the society and trying to limit the influence and the power of the criminal organizations. But at the same time, Ecuador has also seen a high level of political instability over the last couple of years. And in addition to the declaration of the internal armed conflict in 2024, it has had 3 elections over the last 4 years. And that, of course, creates a lot of instability, political instability for the country. And it started out with former President Guillermo Lasso declaring a muerte cruzada in the spring of 2023 and essentially allowing it to dissolve the National Assembly and calling for anticipated elections. And of course, this was complicated and it created an environment of fear and of a lot of instability. But at the same time, the elections were marked by high level of violence during the anticipated elections that took place in the fall of 2023 because one of the presidential candidates was, of course, assassinated. His name is Fernando Villavicencio. And this was, of course, a wake-up call for the majority of Ecuadorians who had already been struggling with high levels of criminal violence. But this was the kind of factor that really allowed people to see the infiltration of the criminal organizations within politics. So after that, that is the election that current President Noboa won. And right now, we are in a third election that has been called for Noboa to complete former President Guillermo Lasso's term. And we had the first round of elections already happen in February of this year, and then we're going to have the second round now in April. So that's where we're at right now. I want to kind of dive in a little bit into the organized crime landscape of the country, which I think is very particular to Ecuador and something that I'm sure we're going to discuss more in detail here with the panelists. But I would like to describe it in a very particular case because there are different groups that operate within Ecuador. It's not just the local gangs. It's also the drug cartels and the transnational criminal organizations and also certain European mafias. So all of these groups have different structures, have different ways and policies that are that should be implemented to address it. And of course, it's the roles of the different organizations are also different. The majority of the violent acts and the crime and violence that we're seeing in Ecuador is as a result of the operations of local gangs that are operating in the country and sometimes subcontracted by broader international drug cartels. And the particular case of Ecuador is that the local gangs are largely fragmented. So it's not like in other countries that across the region that we've seen, for example, Mexico or Colombia or Peru during Sendero Luminoso, for example, a period of time. But we are talking about 22 criminal gangs that are largely fragmented and that have different kind of interests, and those are only the ones that have been designated as terrorist organizations. Of course, there are many more. And in addition, right, the international drug cartels and also the transnational criminal organizations, they are billion-dollar businesses, right? And they are not just in charge of the drug trade that, of course, is happening through Ecuador because of its strategic geographical location, but they are also in charge of different other types of illicit trade, such as arms trafficking, human trafficking, human smuggling, and the illegal mining and other types of illicit trade that are, of course, able to sustain the level of revenue that these groups have and make it really hard for the government to really combat the magnitude and the power that they hold over the society. And then finally, I would say the elections that we're in right now are highly critical for the future of the country because Noboa has had a little bit over a year to truly govern and take over a country that was, inundated with crime and violence. But going forward, whoever wins these elections is going to have a 4-year term and is going to inherit, a heightened level of violence. We've seen that the first 45 days of the year, there were over 1,000 homicides, and that level is the double what we see in the 45 days of the year of 2024. So, of course, it's a very complicated problem to address. But the next president will have to really, really hone in on the skills and strategies available to them to really take over the situation. And it's a very polarized environment. So we saw in the first round of elections, Noboa, of course, came out first with, I believe it was 43% or 44% of the votes. And then we had Luisa Gonzalez, who's the main opposition candidate representing the party of former President Rafael Correa, come out with 43, almost 44% of the votes. So there's a polarized environment. A lot of the additional votes that went to different people or the other presidential candidates in the first round of election is going to be really important to see how those votes are divided in the second round of elections that is going to take place in April 13. So depending on the candidates' strategies for the next couple of months or the next couple of weeks per se, we will see how the different votes accommodate for the second round of elections. But at the same time, it's important to know that the electoral map has changed a lot, right? So the coastal part of Ecuador, which has been characterized by heightened level of violence, is largely voted for the opposition candidate, so Luisa Gonzalez. Whereas the Andean part of the country, they voted for Daniel Noboa. And so, again, the number one concern for most citizens right now in Ecuador is the heightened crime and violence. And Noboa has had a little over a year to take control of the situation. And clearly there are people in the coastal part of the country that are not seeing much results. So it's going to be really important to see how the strategies that both candidates present differ and what are some of the points where the civilians could really feel identified and could vote for a strategic plan for the future on Ecuador to really reduce the level of crime and violence.
Thank you, Isabel. Ambassador Fitzpatrick, you served in Quito during a critical period. Could you describe the change that you saw in Ecuador while you were there, and the changes in Ecuador's politics, and give your assessment of the two candidates?
Sure, and thank you, Dan, as well, for you and the Hudson Institute for the invitation today, and to Isabel for that great introduction, because it is complex, and because a lot of observers in the States don't necessarily have a lot of depth and context about Ecuador. Let me just add one point to what Isabel said. When I got there, you asked about what I saw. When I got there in 2019, the year before, the homicide rate in Ecuador was about 6 or 7 per 100,000. The United States number that year was 5 per 100,000. This past year, it was up to 43 or 47 per 100,000. That's in 5 years, just over 5 years. It earlier had spiked around 17, but in the last half decade, it has really gone through the roof. So let me talk briefly about how did all this happen to Ecuador, the country that most Americans only know as the gateway to the Galapagos, frankly. And then what are the views of the two candidates on crime, and then just briefly how the public see what the candidates have said about crime. But I see 5 big issues really that have come together in a sort of perfect storm for Ecuador at this time. 4 of them are external factors, actually, that Ecuador can't really do a lot about. Geography, number 1, as mentioned, they're sandwiched between Colombia and Peru, the 2 largest producers of cocaine in the world. Second, ironically, the FARC peace agreement in Colombia, again, geography. That was fantastic, great for Colombia. Really bad indirect hits on Ecuador for a variety of reasons I could get into if we have time. Third, COVID. COVID disrupted societies and commerce globally, while also increasing both global demand and production of drugs in Colombia, while also supercharging the creation of new illegal supply chains. Welcome to the great port systems of Ecuador. A 12-hour drive from the Colombian border now, you can be in Guayaquil in an 18-wheel truck full of cocaine or any other products. Fourth, changes in global drug consumption. U.S. consumption of cocaine actually peaked in 2017. That was before COVID, and it has not recovered. But what has happened is Americans have moved to meth and opioids and fentanyl, a glut of product in the world, and soaring profits in Europe and elsewhere as there's increased demand for cocaine. And all that coming together, I should note that this is not our father's cocaine trade. 30 years ago, when Pablo Escobar was killed in 1993, Colombia produced 100 metric tons of cocaine. Last year, UNODC, the United Nations, estimated 2,664 metric tons, 27 times as much cocaine coming out of Colombia now than 30 years ago. It's responding to a global marketplace and a global demand. The mega shipments go to Europe via the containers out of the ports. Much of what does go to the States from Ecuador seems to travel either on go-fast boats or semi-submersibles, several tons at a time in a load. Much, much larger seizures in Ecuador, up to 60, 70 tons at a time, and in the containers as well. The fifth thing is the one thing that Ecuador does have a major say in, and that's its domestic leadership. They can control who they choose to be their president. And unfortunately, President Rafael Correa, when he was president for 10 full years, 2007 to 17, instituted a whole series of reforms that actually facilitated the presence and expansion of transnational organized crime in the country. He politicized the police. He gutted the military after he could not politicize them. He instituted something called universal citizenship, which facilitated visa-free travel for any human being on planet Earth to Ecuador. No criminal records checks, no tracking of you when you get into the country. You want to open fictitious bank accounts and companies? Go right ahead. all legal. He greatly reduced international cooperation with Colombia in 2008, and then in 2009, shuttered it with the United States. He created prison reform, and I use this term Orwellian to describe it, because there are no longer prisons. They're centers for social rehabilitation. There are no prisoners. You have to call them persons deprived of liberty. There are no guards. They're guides for social rehabilitation. They're unarmed guides, by the way. The only people that have guns are the inmates. Correa also privately accepted FARC financial assistance for his campaign. He privately cut deals with the ELN as well, political deals. He also cut deals with Ecuador's own gangs. Names that Ecuadorians know: Fito, Junior, Rasquiña, the heads of the Troneros. These are the people that he cut deals with. And he didn't take their money. It wasn't a kickback to him. He actually paid them. He partnered with them to keep the peace in the streets. That's how we brought homicides down from 17 per 100,000 down to 5 or 6, because there was enough money to go around. Everybody got a piece. Everybody was happy. So he turned a blind eye to police corruption, to judicial corruption, and he also expelled the United States ambassador over precisely this issue in 2011. He kicked out Heather Hodgers after there was a leak that showed an American confidential report from the embassy suggesting that he no doubt was well aware of the extensive, credible allegations against a police general that Correa had assigned to be head of the police. So all of these things, at a certain point, of course, the traffickers and the gangs at some point they're gonna turn and bite the hand that feeds them. And we've seen that actually in subsequent years, and most dramatically in January of last year. So for presidents after Correa, they had to do what they could to just try to keep the democratic order together, try to expand the rule of law. Noboa, of course, came in 18 months ago. Public is already frustrated, fearful, and tired. The gangs tried to no longer subvert the government, but actually try to take it down. 6 weeks after he took office, they said, here's a young, untested, non-politician. Why do we want to subvert him? Let's just try to literally take over the state. Fortunately, he fought back. The public rallied behind him. He put the army in the streets, put them in charge of the prisons. But even in this limited time, homicide rates were down 15%, and yet another record seizures during his first year in office, 294 metric tons of drugs. That's 3 times all Colombia produced in the time of Pablo Escobar. And this is in a country that doesn't produce any cocaine. So all that together, he's publicly said he wants to work with the United States. He's worked closely with the Europeans and us. He's openly calling for greater international cooperation as well as foreign forces on the ground to help fight the war. Public rewards for information, pardons for military and police involved in or accused of human rights excess is probably the most controversial piece of what he's been doing. But as the incumbent, he's got to run on continued success, right? Luisa, on the other hand, running to the center for the second round of elections, she's soft-pedaling her 21st century socialism credentials because she knows that does not sell in Ecuador. She's mostly just criticizing Noboa for not solving the crime problem. She's otherwise suggesting things I think we could all agree on: greater international cooperation, expanded social spending, or vague reforms without really getting into it, or saying how, this isn't junior varsity criminal transnational organizations anymore. This is the major players in the world. And how are you going to be able to do that when you don't have much money in the bank, and when this is a globally interconnected syndicate that you're trying to fight? She's been very quiet on the issue of public corruption, even as a number of people in her party have been implicated, including in the assassination of the anti-corruption candidate Villavicencio. And she's also been very quiet about whether she'll pursue political accommodation with the traffickers. So lastly, let me note, what do the public think about this? Razor thin polls for the April elections at this point. Most Ecuadorians don't doubt Noboa's anti-crime, anti-narco credentials. Many are suspicious, however, of what they call his authoritarian tendencies, particularly his quickness to view differences in opinion as suspect or a personal affront. But many also fear that Gonzalez's victory would simply usher in the return of Rafael Correa to the country, where he's, after being in self-exile for a decade, because he's facing time in prison. And if he were to return, many people believe that, number one, he'll never relinquish power ever again. And number two, the narcos will have a field day. And so out of all that, let me just say, there's one population that we already do know from the first round elections that is quite interesting. And that is, what about the prisoners in Ecuador today? How did they vote? Well, we know the results. And in the first round with 16 candidates, 91.3% of those prisoners that did vote voted for Luisa Gonzalez. 91.3%. 2.5% voted for Daniel Noboa. They know where their butter is breaded, or their bread is buttered.
Ambassador, thank you. That's a very sobering picture you've provided, and we'll come back to some of these issues. But I want to come to you, John. We've talked a little bit about how Ecuador is a little bit at the mercy of larger things happening in the region. Can you talk about how the Ecuadorian situation fits into the larger challenge in the region with criminality and insecurity?
Certainly, Dan. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Pleasure to be here with some real experts. I actually want to pick up first on something the ambassador said. I agree wholeheartedly with the points that you raised as precipitating this crisis that we see today, violence and things like that. You mentioned a name though that I think also is involved in causing this massive violence, and that's Rasquiña, who is
Absolutely.
head of Choneros gang, who was assassinated at a food court in a shopping mall in the city of Manta, 4 years ago. And what that did is it broke down essentially the hegemony that criminal group had over the narcotics trade on the Ecuadorian coast. And he had ties to Mexican cartels as well. And so there was already a transnationalization of the drug trade, but not, let's say, a concomitant rise in violence as a result of that being kind of consolidated. And what that assassination did was it fractured the leadership of Choneros. There were several splinter groups that broke off. And there was intra-cartel violence then that essentially has not stopped since that point. And it's spread, right, from coastal hubs like Guayaquil and Duran especially, which is, I think, maybe the most violent municipality in the world, outside of war zones, to other places like, Manta and Montecristi and Puerto Viejo and Esmeraldas and places along the coast, Machala, which is a very dangerous city right now, and even spread into the highlands. And in part, I think part of the discrepancy in the vote that we see may also be due to different presence of gangs, in addition to the historical, coastal highland cleavage. But one additional point, not disagreeing with anything else you said, but something I think important to keep in mind from what we know about criminal violence and transnational organized crime and organized criminal violence globally. When there is a hegemonic power controlling the trade, generally violence is low because they don't need to employ it for any ends. But when there's fragmentation, violence is employed to consolidate control, right? And we've seen a similar thing now. Bringing it kind of to the regional level, we have seen things like this occur cyclically in Colombia. We've seen this happen in Mexico, in slow motion in the Mexican case over the course of kind of the PRI losing its hegemony in the late 90s, early 2000s. So, I guess that brings me to what I had written down in some of my notes, which is, Ecuador's struggle with organized crime and violence and transnational organized crime, as you referred to, is actually rather recent, right? It dates to probably the late 2010s or the early 2020s, whereas in much of the rest of the region, that has existed with this high levels of violence for decades, right? Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, through Central America, and places like this. What this means is that Ecuador's situation, even though it's more recent, is not unique, right? And Ecuador, I think, the leadership of the country, be it Noboa or someone else, can learn from other countries in the region. And we know kind of what transnational organized crime and what organized crime and its violence has done to these other societies. We know that this is a very pressing contemporary problem. It fuels insecurity, obviously fuels violence. It fuels corruption, which is something I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to talk about today. And I think it also poses an existential threat to democratic rule, right? Something that we certainly can touch upon with relation to maybe El Salvador, maybe some of the programs that critics of Noboa have criticized, to be redundant. Right, Latin Americans themselves are aware of this. Ecuadorians are aware of this. In a 2024 regional survey from a Chilean think tank, respondents rated organized crime as the region's top political risk, ahead of economic growth, the state of democracy, environment, all these sorts of things that regularly come up. This reflects the increase of transnational organized crime, even in places where it historically has not been a problem. So in Costa Rica, in Chile, in Uruguay, right, in Rosario, in Argentina, and certainly, more than anywhere else, Ecuador, right? The costs of this throughout the region on economies, societies, and governments are really significant. Transnational organized crime causes financial losses. It undermines legitimate markets, right? So it hurts legitimate economic growth. It drains public resources, right, through enforcement and lost tax revenue. A problem that Noboa had to confront early last year was he wanted to raise the tax rate, especially on high earners, the way that Colombia had done during Plan Colombia. And essentially, the wealthy in Ecuador said, no, we don't want to do that, right? But he needed that extra money to fight crime. And so it's a real drain on an already, in this case, struggling economy. We know that organized crime in general rises from a combination of social, economic, political, structural factors. That's not news. But economic inequality and poverty obviously contribute to this. These are push factors that push individuals into illicit industries and criminality as means of survival, right? Ineffective governance also contributes to this because the state doesn't provide for citizens, so citizens look elsewhere to provide for themselves, right? And then there's this persistent demand for illegal goods, the way that the ambassador spoke about the United States, right? So demand for drugs and other illicit contraband help to fuel this, right? Weapons being something else. And these provide really lucrative opportunities for groups, not just in Mexico, but throughout the hemisphere. I'm going to skip a bunch of things that I had written down. I think that there is a really big point, that one thing that I get to say that's new that these other experts haven't cited, which is stateness, right? State capacity is central to the rise, survival, and flourishing of organized crime. And so this can take one of two forms, right? One can be low stateness or state neglect. So traveling to peripheral regions of Ecuador, one is struck by the lack of, let's say, passable roads or potable water or electrical infrastructure and things like this, let alone things like internet. And so it's no surprise that in the absence of the state that illicit industries would spring up and flourish, right? In the mangrove swamps around Esmeraldas, or in similar mangrove swamps in the Batlle area, because where the state is absent, and it means that law enforcement is absent, capacity is low, organized crime can flourish. A second thing, though, that has arisen in the Ecuadorian case and many other parts of Latin America is it's not just state neglect, but state protection, which has given rise to organized crime, right? TCOs, transnational criminal organizations, they exploit gaps in authority, they exploit corruption and a lack of public trust to establish control, but they can fill governance voids in some cases. That's mainly not the experience with Ecuador, but it is in other countries. But they can capture the state. And they capture the state through bribing, co-opting the police force, the military, the courts, and politicians. And unfortunately, in Ecuador, we have all of that, right? As the caso metastasis case has revealed, this case that was brought, accusations brought by the Attorney General Diana Salazar against dozens of prosecutors, politicians, members of the police force, members of the military, on and on and on, and public employees who were paid off, bribed, and judges as well, right? Pushed to look the other way, paid off by a kind of a really deeply entrenched network of criminal actors, in part headed by Leandro Norero, a guy who was killed in, when was he killed? 2002?
No.
22.
22.
That's what I meant. 22 is what I meant. 2022. Yeah. So essentially, looking at his cell phone, his digital records, and found this vast web, right? That would sound like a conspiracy, but it really was a criminal conspiracy. It wasn't something that was made up.
Documented.
Yeah, absolutely documented, right? And so you could see kind of the degree to which the state itself had been captured in a very short time, right? In very few years, and showed that the weak. The weak willpower of the state to fight organized crime, and the willingness to look the other, and the willingness to take this money to look the other way. I'm going to say one more thing, which is simply, both of you have spoken about the transnational aspect of this. TOC, transnational organized crime in Ecuador, there are homegrown organized criminal groups, but Isabel, you spoke about foreign groups, right? The Albanian mafia, famously. China as well has criminal groups in Ecuador. The Sinaloa cartel, the Jalisco New Generation cartel is in Ecuador as well. Colombian groups, obviously trafficking cocaine into the country. And so this is not just homegrown crime, it's transnational in scope. And what that means, that the fact that it's transnational means that fighting it is going to require a transnational lens, and not just the Ecuadorian state, a single president making a decision and fighting this crime. No, it's going to take a concerted, I think, regional effort and probably extra hemispheric effort as well, and lots of resources. I think this is another reason the election will matter right now in April. Is not just what Noboa's security plan is or what Luisa's security plan isn't, as the case may be, but rather how they plan on cooperating with foreign governments or trying to receive security cooperation in order to fight these groups, not just within Ecuador, but in the ports, on the borders, and abroad. Yeah.
Thank you, John. Isabel, I want to shift gears just a little bit. John alluded to some of the economic factors that have contributed to the expansion of organized crime, but we know that Ecuador is in a very difficult economic situation. Can you talk more about the economic factors that have facilitated the insecurity in Ecuador, and then in turn how the insecurity is shaping Ecuador's economic outlook?
Yeah, absolutely. A very important factor and a very intertwined factor with the level of crime and violence that we're seeing in the country. I'd just like to add, just to give the audience a little bit of the magnitude of the problem, in addition to what the panelists have said here. According to the current government, if you sum up or add up all of the total revenue of the local gangs from Ecuador, they have an annual revenue that is equal to the external debt for Ecuador. So that's $48 million annual revenue. So this is the level of economic power, right, that the country is dealing with. And then, according again to the government of Ecuador, and this is a statistic that usually varies because of the lack of information that there is around this, but there's 60,000 Ecuadorians that are involved in the local gangs in Ecuador. So imagine 60,000 people operating in these different gangs. The state capacity to fight that is really, really complex. And then now going back to the economy, right, that factors that have helped, the expansion of TCOs and local gangs, I think, John, you touched on one that is very important, and that's the level of informality, right? 58% of Ecuadorians have informal jobs in the Ecuadorian economy. So that's more than half of the population. And this, of course, allows them to be in very vulnerable situations, not having a health insurance, not having a stable income, kind of living day by day. And the gangs and the transnational criminal organizations, they take advantage of those situations and provide better economic alternatives by employing people that are in vulnerable situations. And then in terms of the poverty, right, Ecuador, 28 people out of 100 people in Ecuador are in a level of poverty, and half of that value in extreme levels of poverty. So of course, if you see the pockets of criminal violence that John was mentioning before, right, Machala, Duran, Esmeraldas, these are also provinces in Ecuador that are characterized by high levels of poverty. So of course, there's a link there. And the Ecuadorian economy, unfortunately, since the pandemic, has not grown a lot. And I think we're forgetting a factor that is really important, and that is the fact that Ecuador is a dollarized economy. So we do not have our own currency, which means that our monetary policy is very limited. And the growth of the economy is going to depend largely on external factors like international trade, like, just the level of growth of external investment or foreign direct investment. And because of the level of uncertainty given politics and the rising crime and violence, we have seen the country risk rise. And that means that, of course, foreign direct investment is lower. And that affects not only foreign investment, but also local investment across the country. And again, Ecuador, because of this lack of level of growth that we're seeing, it also has a big fiscal deficit that Noboa inherited. 5.4% of its GDP is the fiscal deficit that Ecuador has. So, of course, how do you manage an economy if you inherit that level of a fiscal deficit? It allows very limited flexibility for the government to be able to spend the resources that it needs to spend to really control the criminal violence that Ecuador is experiencing. And to do the institutional reforms that John and Ambassador Fitzpatrick were mentioning that are needed to truly be able to take control of the situation. And then, of course, in turn, right, those are some of the factors. I'm happy to speak more in detail about these factors, but in turn, some of the reasons why transnational criminal organizations have impacted the current economy in Ecuador is, of course, the sort of policies that are currently in place to control the violent situation. So, for example, state of emergencies. There are curfews in place that, of course, limit commercial activity. There's an increase in the VAT tax to be able to finance the internal armed conflict. That, of course, affects the economy. And then the level of extortions in Ecuador is something that we haven't touched a lot here, but the level of extortions that we're seeing across the country have caused that many small businesses are closing down because they can't bear the added cost of having criminal gangs or members of these gangs come in and charge the vacunas, as they are called, in Ecuador. And then I will say, we haven't talked about an important factor here, which is the more long-term effects in the Ecuadorian economy and what this means more long-term. And I mentioned the 60,000 members of the criminal gangs in Ecuador because 70% of that value is people that are below 25 years old. So it's a lost generation that we're seeing in the future years for Ecuador, right? It's a population that doesn't have any economic alternatives and is being part of the criminal gangs in Ecuador and not getting an education, and their life expectancies once they join the gangs do not exceed the 5 years. So this is a crisis that, of course, affects the Ecuadorian youth very much. And in turn, right, this is a generation of future professionals that could have a very different reality going forward and contributing to the productive sector of the economy. And, that we are not seeing that, unfortunately. Then I will say another thing that is impacting specifically the private sector and their inability to kind of invest the added funds that they have at the end of the year in research and innovation and the growth of their own business is that they are investing really large percentages in private security because of course their operations and their supply chains are being contaminated and they are budgeting for of course levels of extortions that happen at different parts of the supply chain. And that level of investment in private security in trying to protect the companies is investment that could be used, to employ more people or to grow the companies, to contribute to the productive sector of the economy in Ecuador, and that's something that we're not seeing. One thing that I'd like to add that I'm sure Ambassador Fitzpatrick will also have something to say on this is the fact that Ecuador is one of the few countries in the Pacific coast, perhaps not the only country in the Pacific coast, that unfortunately does not have a free trade agreement with the United States. And the United States continues to be the main trading partner with Ecuador. And of course, what does this mean, right? Colombia and Peru have free trade agreements. So Colombia is a huge exporter of roses into the United States. And of course, the Ecuadorian roses come in, but they come in with tariffs. So obviously, they're not competitive. And because we have the dollar as part of our economy, that international trade aspect of it for businesses to grow, for the economy to grow, is really important. And that's an area that unfortunately Ecuador has not been able to grow as much in terms of international trade with the United States. But it has found other ways to grow, and that's, for example, the free trade agreement that the country signed with China or with the European Union. And this is an important factor that I think we should consider because it is very much intertwined with, the economic future of the country that right now has very limited levels of growth, and that is affecting in turn the local economy and the kind of ways that people are financing and having their own economies and being able to live on an income, right, a respectable income.
Yeah. So as a quick follow-up to that, are these economic issues really coming to the fore in the debate for these elections, and are either of the candidates proposing any promising solutions to these issues, in particular the issue of youth employment and what I think is shaping up to be a real crisis, because as you have attrition in criminal gangs, the need for more recruits grows, and it becomes one of the main careers for young people. So what are you seeing from the candidates on this issue?
Yes, it's very interesting how both of them are approaching it. I would say from the Noboa side, one of the policies that we are seeing time and time again is spaces for recreation, specifically so that youth don't have to be in the streets, because the streets is the main place where the local gangs truly are able to get them and recruit them, as well as prisons, right, which is a different topic. But recreation space and more entrepreneurial opportunities for people to invest in their own businesses. That is also something that he's putting forward. And then he is trying to make the job market a little bit more flexible. What happens with Ecuador is that the labor laws that we have are back from 1920. And so that does not allow for example, part-time jobs to be, or part-time jobs exist, but hourly wages are not existent. And so that is a way that he's trying to formalize the economy in making sure that, right, we can hire people by an hourly basis so that they can be part of a business, of a formal business, and reduce the level of informality, which is a creative way of addressing the problem, of course. From Gonzalez's side, not as many punctual proposals or policies on the economic front. She has said on multiple occasions that there's going to be bonuses that are given to different families that are, in poverty. We've seen that in the past. It remains unclear where that money is going to come from, because as I mentioned, Ecuador is still in a very wide fiscal deficit. So some of analysts say that they are going to touch international reserves. And that, of course, is very dangerous in a slippery slope in Ecuador, potentially losing its dollarized economy, which, Ecuador has seen heightened levels of political instability over the last couple of years. But I believe that the dollar has really been the source of stability in the economy, despite the political stability, and what has really kept the economy somewhat in the correct rails.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Ambassador Fitzpatrick, I think it's an open question of whether the justice system in Ecuador can deliver for the Ecuadorians. There will be some decisions made early on in the next administration. What are some things that we should be watching for in terms of Ecuador's judiciary?
Yeah, clearly what we've seen is it's very quick and easy to break things. It's going to be really hard and slow to fix things, regardless of who wins, whether it's Luisa Gonzalez or Daniel Noboa. Noboa, it's interesting to reflect quickly. He first ran on a center-left social development platform before the Villavicencio assassination. Then when he got elected, he obviously had to govern as a wartime commander-in-chief. Very different. Luisa, also, the big question for her is judicial. A number of senior members of that party convicted of corruption, some of them for narcotics and other crimes. Some of them are abroad, some have been extradited or are in prison in Ecuador. The question is, judicially speaking, will her government open those prison doors for those folks? Or will she say, you broke the law, you have to pay the consequences? That's going to be one of the real tests for her. But either way, one of the big issues for the next government is going to be who's going to be the next attorney general. Normally, and you mentioned Diana Salazar, her 6-year non-renewable tenure expires next month. They should have selected her replacement months ago so that it didn't get involved in the national politics. At this point, it's been so slow-rolled, they won't have a new attorney general probably till May or June, clearly after the elections. And whoever's the next president may be able to put a finger on the balance on that, which is supposed to be an independent effort. But it was Diana Salazar who broke open the metastasis case after Villavicencio was assassinated and laid bare the corruption, the narcotics corruption, the judicial corruption. Whoever replaces her is going to have to be as disciplined and as fearless as she is, because the transnational organized crime elements and their local counterparts will go after him or her with the same intensity, if not greater intensity than they've gone after Diana Salazar, who has, I think, probably a bigger security detail than the president does at this point.
And with good reason.
Yes, and with all the reasons in the world. But we know what happens when presidents put their fingers on the scales of justice. They don't just do it once. And so that's going to be one of the real initial steps to see. Last year, another one is 2/3 of Ecuadorians voted in favor of extradition for Ecuadorian citizens sought abroad for crimes. So they could end up in European or American jails rather than running back to Ecuador and going, you can't touch me. And I'll continue to delinquir, to commit crimes from here. 2/3 of them voted in favor of that. Is Luisa going to support that as Noboa has? Or is she going to say, as Correa did for many years, sovereignty, sorry. But no man is an island and no country is an island. Not even a former island of peace is either an island or peaceful now. So those are two of the big ones. The next attorney general, the question of extradition, and the question really of, for Luisa in particular, how much is she really going to be able to cleanse her own party so that she can really be the leader of her party? Because the suspicion is that she's, by many people, she's a puppet of Rafael Correa. If she's genuinely going to be the president, then she's going to have to put down markers and limitations on corruption in her own ranks. And frankly, if she's a reformist, that's going to be the best thing for her to do, to be able to cleanse her own ranks and solidify a national unified defense against narcos. Because I will say this in conclusion, It's not her political opponents, and it's not the United States that are going to be the biggest threats to her in office if she becomes the president. It's going to be the same thing as it's going to be if it's Daniel Noboa, and that's going to be transnational organized crime trying to take down their government and state.
Sobering. We're getting close to the hour mark, and I had several more questions, but there have been a few common themes throughout this discussion, and I'm going to sort of summarize several ideas into one question for everyone on the panel. But John has talked a little bit about the question of state capacity and whether there's even the will in Ecuador's political class to fight organized crime. My question is, in the best of cases, if you have the best possible outcome from the election, if the correct decisions are made on a next attorney general and so on, does Ecuador have the will and the ability to subdue organized crime? What will it take to do this? What kind of support does it need from the United States and from others? And then there's sort of a regional dimension. We're talking about transnational criminal organizations. Does it even make sense to talk about domestic efforts, or do we need to be more focused on regional approaches to countering organized crime? So
I think
open to everyone.
I think positive developments are likely to be more incremental than total. So I think we needed to be mindful of that it's not good. Any positive change will not come in one fell swoop, right? And any ambitious leader is going to have to develop a long-term security plan, not just the current Plan Phoenix or something like that. A long-term security plan ensuring that judges and lawyers are not beholden to criminal groups, right? That they're, if not impenetrable, that they are harder to penetrate, right? That politicians and public officials are accountable, right? There needs to be a plan to rebuild the country's feeble anti-narcotics units, right, that have been decimated. Ecuador will need to strengthen cooperation with, and I will say, with the United States, right? Ecuador needs the United States. And I think the United States needs Ecuador too, right? Because one of the effects, economic effects, and other effects of violence is an increase in migration. We've already seen that on the southern border, right? So if the United States is really interested in curbing undocumented migration from Ecuador, then it behooves us to invest in security cooperation. To bolster the state's presence on its borders and ports, which is something I've already said, right? And to cooperate with Colombia as well, which is a separate issue if the Colombian government is willing to do that or not. I think also long-term you have to think about obviously financing and where do you get the money to finance, but you need public money to finance education, to invest in employment and things like this. That's going to be a challenge. But I think that change needs to be incremental.
Yeah, I agree with everything that John said. I would just add a couple of things from a local perspective, right, on Ecuador, more than the broader region, is capacity building. I think that is essential and something that Ecuador definitely needs. And we didn't get a chance to talk about the prison system, which is a large component of the problem in Ecuador in particular. But capacity building for the institution that is in charge of the prisons and the enough resources to be able to pay for good professionals to be part of that, and to strengthen intelligence, because that is both financial intelligence and also military intelligence, because the dollar is great, but it also facilitates money laundering, right, for multiple transnational criminal organizations. And Ecuador has no experience dealing with these issues. So they need the United States and they need other regional partners to be able to help in the capacity building to strengthen both the institutions and support the reforms of the institutions, such as the SNAI, which is the institution in charge of the prisons, but also in terms of capacity building to really improve the security of illicit financing and military intelligence. It is quite sobering, the fact that the current intelligence unit that we have in Ecuador, which is largely recent, the person that is in charge of it is the minister of the government of Ecuador. That doesn't happen. Usually the intelligence unit, they have their own, they're independent to the government of choice. So of course, making sure that unit is fully capable and has the capacities and the resources needed to be able to contribute to the military operations and support the more broadly the policies to counter illicit finance, illicit trade, and transnational criminal organizations is going to be essential going forward.
Thank you. Ambassador Fitzpatrick?
Well said.
All right. Good. We have time for one or two questions from the audience, if there are any. Right here.
Hi, Erin B. And I'm just curious, thank you very much, for reflections on the mano dura approach to security and stabilization. I think a lot of what's been said sort of touches on that, but either in reference to why something that might work in one country might not work in Ecuador, or what else needs to complement that to potentially make it more sustainable and effective. Thank you.
Just quickly, my view is mano dura. I think of a leaky boat. You got to put both hands down on where the leak is coming in, but that doesn't solve your problem. It just buys you time. It's the first, perhaps necessary step. But you have to have it done in a context that protects the rights of everyone else in that lifeboat with you, the citizens of the country, and in defense of the Constitution. Or, we haven't mentioned it, another early thing for the next government may well be Ecuador's 21st Constitution in 200 years. There may well be a constitutional convention, regardless of who wins.
And I'll add just to say to that question, right? We've seen the quote-unquote success of the mano dura policy in El Salvador by many of the citizens of El Salvador and the approval rates of Bukele, right? But I think it's very important to notice the differences between the El Salvador model with Ecuador. It's very, very different landscape. And part of what I was explaining about the different typologies of the different organized crime groups that we have in the country, it's not the same as in El Salvador. So replicating that model, it truly wouldn't work for Ecuador in the short term or in the long term.
It hasn't worked so far.
Yeah, it hasn't worked so far.
There's another question in the front.
Thank you. I had a question about you had mentioned the military force with the internal conflict. Do you see the U.S. Southern Command having a larger relationship with Ecuador's military because of that?
That's a really good question, and Ambassador, you also feel free to take that question. Or John.
I was slated to bring a group of midshipmen from the Naval Academy to Ecuador in a mill-to-mill exchange in May and June because the United States understands the value of this relationship. My travel card has been frozen, but if it's unfrozen, if I'm granted an exemption, that will take place. And I believe in that mission. I believe it's useful for the United States. I believe it's in the U.S.'s best interests, in Southcom's best interests, and in the Ecuador military's best interests. So, I'm too close to speak objectively about it, I think.
I think what you said is exactly right. It's, the military is not the solution, much less the sole solution to Ecuador's challenges, but it is a piece of the puzzle. And so therefore we need to work with the police, with the military, with intelligence, with judicial authorities, with the private sector, all across the board, all rowing in the same direction, to get back to my leaky boat, all rowing in the same direction. And yes, that includes military, but it also requires a willing partner in the United States government, not just Ecuador. It takes two to tango.
I think that's particularly important in the maritime presence of the Ecuadorian military, not just the kind of internal security, but especially in Galapagos, right? With the threat of transnational organized crime there, and Chinese fishing, and all sorts of things going on there, and in the ports. And so, I couldn't agree more.
All right. Final thoughts, Isabel?
Well, I think we've discussed most of the key things, but I guess I would just say Ecuador finds itself right now in a truly critical moment, and these elections are truly going to be very important for the future of the country. And one way or another, what happens in Ecuador, because we've seen that this threat is transnational in nature, it's going to somehow impact the rest of the region, including the United States, whether it's through migration flows, whether it's through the drug trade or other forms of illicit trade. And I don't think we can no longer look at this issue by a country basis, and we really need to start addressing this threat as global and regional as it is, and the policies that should be implemented to address it should be in that way as well.
Thank you. John?
If history is any indication, it won't be quick, but there are ways for Ecuador to get out of the hole that it's in right now.
Ambassador?
I think both of the candidates are they've got how many weeks before the election? 4?
3.
3 weeks? Well, the first, I think both are looking for some way to, as we would say in the States, have an October surprise, a last minute success of some kind that swings the undecided or non-committed voters their direction. One possibility is this Sunday night's the one and only debate between these two candidates is Sunday night. And that may shift either a small group or maybe a large group of voters one way or the other. We'll see.
Great. Thank you. Well, you've given us a lot to think about. There's a lot that bears watching. I appreciate John's final optimistic note, and so I want to end on that. But thank you to each of you for coming and for providing a really rich discussion here.
Thank you, Dan.
Having
Thank you.
us.
Thank you.